You're listening to the Joel Martin Mastery Podcast, home of the 2-hour deep dive interview with gold, platinum, and multi-platinum bands, including Stained, Blue Rodeo, The Arkells, Finger 11, Big Wreck, Moist, Bedouin Soundclash, I Mother Earth, Ill Scarlet, Neverending White Lights, Thornley, and many more. Please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, as well as share, comment, and like. Now let's dive in to today's episode. Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of the podcast. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. We are joined by a very special guest. He's achieved a level of mastery as a vocalist, as a guitarist, and as a songwriter for the platinum-selling band Treble. So welcome to the podcast, making his triumphant return, Bill Priddle. Bill, how are you? And how's the new music coming along? You sent me some demos a few months ago. They sounded awesome, and I'm excited. I want to know when I can get my hands on this stuff.
I'm hoping we're going to have something. We have a couple shows in June in Toronto and Hamilton. So we're hoping to have at least one song done at that point. We're playing with Rusty and Lightmare as a band that I produced, and they're from Sudbury and they know Ken from Rusty. So it should be a really cool bill. It's a Garrison, Friday, June 15th, I believe. When it is June 16th.
June 16th.
And then another venue in Hamilton on the 17th.
That's exciting. And do you see it when you have new music and you're going to play live? Do you see the live performance as a way to flesh out those songs, to test them out on a crowd, or are they basically done and you're more just showcasing?
Well, I'm really taking my time with this thing. So we've done about 8 or 9 shows with most of these songs. So yeah, I don't really subscribe to the live testing thing. I don't look to any audience other than my own ears, really, when I make music. I've learned that's the best way to do things. And that's the way that people that I love do things. I mean, all the people on my list are they didn't go out to make radio hits.
That's very true. Yeah, it's different than comedians. I'm a big fan of stand-up comedians, and they say they essentially can't write without an audience, because you have to see, the laughter is such an important part of the set that until you test it, see what sticks against the wall, you don't know if you're doing well or not. So it's very different, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I've done lots of gigs as cover bands and solo gigs where people pay no attention. So I gotta pay no attention to them. It was just a month ago where I finished a set with my cover band. We were killing it, and there was nothing. And between sets, I was saying to the guys, I feel like people are, if only there a way to like non-verbally express that you like the band, some sort of rhythmic, I don't know what,
it's too much to ask for,
something like that. Yeah.
That's tough. I in the last few months, I've been playing open mics in Ottawa just for fun. And it's, I'm on stage, I'm looking out, and out of, I don't know, say there's 50 people, there's literally one face looking back at me. Everyone else is facing the other way. And you're like, why am I even playing? Nobody cares.
Sometimes there's faces looking at me and then they don't clap.
I guess that's worse. Yeah. That's too funny. So the cover band, is that All the Tired Horses that you're talking about?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay. So there are different shows in Sault Ste. Marie, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And, we have listeners, mostly in Canada, mostly in Ontario. If there is anyone within driving distance of Sault Ste. Marie, is this like a once a month thing, or?
Yeah, we have a residency at a place called the Whiskey Barrel. It's the second Saturday of every month.
Okay. Awesome. So for our listeners that are just tuning in, and this is the first time that there's a Bill Priddle interview with me, just to let them know that we did a full deep dive interview back in August of 2022. This was on episode 71, 2 hours. We went through your whole life, your career, discography. So for anyone that missed that, go back, get the whole life story. And then here, this is a part of a new series called My Five Favorite Albums, where the most popular musical guests from the past, they come back and we just nerd out on all-time great music. So that's what we're going to do here today. And I just want to point out that I'm going on 100 interviews now. We're going to hit that number in the next few episodes. And with 100 interviews, yours is still in the top 10 most downloaded on Spotify, Apple, and Google. So you are a fan favorite. Nice. So when I started this new series, I said, we got to get Bill back, and here you are. So to show the fan love that we have, I'm going to start with a fan question that's sent in. And this is from Andrew Melford. And he says, Bill is my favorite non-Rush affiliated musician of all time. You got to have a caveat with Rush, right? You just have to assume everyone loves Rush. He says, I'm so jealous you're getting to interview him again. I have a million questions for him, but I don't want to take over the whole interview. If I had to pick just one, I'd ask what the future holds for him. Any more music being released? Is Treble Charger still active in any extent? Will their first two albums ever become available to listen to in the US on Spotify? I guess it's not in the US. He says, I'm desperate to listen to them. And then he says, really, just let him know that his music has literally changed my life. I even named my own band Detox after the Treble Charger album. So that's from Andrew Melford. Those are some kind words.
Yep.
That is pretty sweet. So lots of questions in there. I guess the three, is there new music on the way? So we talked about that a little bit. And I guess, were you aware that the Treble Charger isn't on Spotify in the US? I listen to Treble Charger, but I'm in Canada, so I don't know.
No, I didn't. I think there's a possibility we might reissue Self Equals Title, so that might come with a digital release at all as well. I think we're trying to release it on vinyl, but that's just in early stages. So I hope that goes through.
Okay, sounds good. And the last thing before we dive into your five favorite albums, I just wanted to point out on the wall of fame behind me. So these are my 12 favorite albums from artists that have been on the podcast. In your honor, up here, we have the album. So that is there with some other incredible albums, just to honor you. So let's dive into the five favorite albums, and we're going to change it up a little bit. Normally we up front say these are the five favorite albums. We do a deep dive into those. And at the end, the guests are such music lovers that they can't get by on just 5 albums. They have to have an honorable mentions list. We're going to do it different. We're going to start with your honorable mentions list, and then we're going to go into the top 5. So do you want to list off some of these great albums?
Yeah. I mean, first off, I want to say this is much more fun for me than talking about myself. I have so many honorable mentions. I'm going to start with the obvious ones, the ones that come up on critics' lists all the time. So Velvet Underground and Nico, Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street, Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, Beatles' White Album or Double Album, or the Beatles' Van Morrison Astral Weeks. These are all, there's a reason they're on critics' list all the time. They're pretty much flawless front to back. I mean, Velvet Underground's a little unlistable, but it's also like smashing through reality, time, space, and I describe it as 50s music from outer space.
And very influential, right? It changed everything.
Very, very influential, yeah. The next tier is albums that I love that are, Sonic Youth Washing Machine, Television Marquee Moon, Cheap Trick Heaven Tonight, Big Star, pick one, #1 record, Radio City, even the third one is great. The Strokes, Is This It?
That's another newer one on your list, yeah.
Flawless record, front to back. REM Out of Time, REM Automatic for the People, REM Reckoning.
REM fan, okay.
Yeah, REM, they're as influential as the Velvet Underground. You know, if you take away, REM, then thousands of bands disappear like the photos in Back to the Future.
REM basically gave permission for bands to sign to a major label without feeling like they're selling out. Like, I don't think you have Nirvana going from the indie label to Nevermind major label if you don't have the influence of REM in there.
Yeah. Stereolab Dots and Loops. Stereolab was one of my favorite albums in the 90s. It consistently put out great albums. These two albums, I always think of them as a pair. Flaming Lips, Soft Bulletin, and Spiritualized, Ladies and Gentlemen, We Are Floating in Space. These are 90s records that everyone loved. You know, metal guys would rave about Spiritualized. They were just, everything came together for these bands, and they're just amazing sounding records with amazing songs. Wire, Chairs Missing. And then the next category would be bands, albums that I really wanted to be on the top 5, and it was really hard to cross them off. The Kinks, We Are the Village Green Preservation Society. Again, flawless front to back. Sounds, 1967, it sounds like it was recorded between, I don't know, 1980 and 1995. The Velvet Underground, the third album. You know, the Velvet Underground were awesome at shooting themselves in the foot. So the first album was bizarre. The second album was, people call them unlistenable. The engineer famously said, if this is what you guys are going to do, this button presses record, I'm out of here. I'm not going to listen to this. Pavement, Wowie Zowie. Pavement, I'm going to talk more about them in the Steely Dan section, but again, a flawless record, beautifully sequenced, sprawling, expansive. Joni Mitchell, Hey Gira, just like sacred music, really. Neil Young, Tonight's the Night, kind of like the Neil Young aficionados' favorite album. It's just, they didn't want to, the record company made him shelve it for 3 years because it was too raw and uncompromising. It's just an amazing listen all the way through. And Let It Be by the Replacements. Just like a masterpiece of, I don't know. So those are my honorable mentions.
Wow, you might have put more time into that list than anybody in this series so far. I know you were squirming just trying to come up with your top 5. So I know you actually put some thought into it and took some time. I'll have to go back and check out this part of the episode to write out that list and check out those albums.
Well, I thought a lot about the criteria for this list, and my criteria are, it's got to be something that floored me when I listened to it first and still floors me now. And that's kind of the big criteria. And then the other criteria was like, it had to be super solid from front to back, no duds. It had to be very influential in how I think musically. And yeah.
Okay. When I was in Toronto for 11 years, and they would have free concerts at the Eaton Center, I guess Dundas Square. They'd have free concerts every now and then. And there was a free Flaming Lips concert that I went to, which is insane. So I got to see the Flaming Lips where the singer goes out in that ball and floats over the crowd like he's an alien. Pretty amazing. Their song "Do You Realize," that has to be like one of the greatest songs of all time.
Yeah.
It's such an incredible song, man. The lyrics, they'll get you.
Yeah. There's a similar, that's the album after the one I mentioned. There's a similar song called "Feeling Yourself Disintegrate," and it's similarly about love and death. And it's incredibly concise.
So the album you chose, it was Soft Bulletin?
Yeah.
So the album would, Do You Realize, it's something like Yoshimi Battles the Robots or something?
That's correct, yeah.
They're such a unique band, eh? There's just nobody like them. It's good they got the commercial breakthrough. It seems like they've kind of always done well on the live front. Like people know that you go to the show
Yeah.
and you're getting something incredible. And it's nice to see that they get, the critical acclaim and then the actual album sales as well, breaking through with some big singles.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. They're I don't know when the last time they put out an album was, but I keep seeing every few years I see new albums. So they're still doing the damn thing.
Yeah.
All right. So we got your 5 fave albums you came down to. Do you want to list the 5? I have them in front of me. If you want me to list them, up to you.
Yeah, why don't you list them?
All right. So we have Bob Dylan, Highway 61 Revisited, Steely Dan, The Royal Scam, Guided by Voices, Alien Lanes, Joe Walsh, The Smoker You Drink, The Player You Get, and Talking Heads, Fear of Music. So looking at those 5 albums, how much do you think they influenced you as a singer, as a guitarist, as a songwriter?
I would think their influence is kind of subconscious at this point. I don't know. It's hard to be influenced by Dylan because he's so untouchable. You can't go, I'm going to write a Bob Dylan style song. It'll be great.
True.
It's more, I don't know. It's funny. People, when I talk about music with people, they sometimes say, oh, well, I'm cheating or it's different for you. You're a musician. And I kind of take offense to that because I consider myself maybe even foremost a listener. Like I love listening to music, and it doesn't always need to have anything to do with my ability to play guitar or sing or I mean, I think one of the things that makes me a good producer is just I've listened to so much music, I've obsessed over it so much that I understand how songs work, and it kind of comes natural to me. So for me, the albums, they just they put you in a state of mind, and it's more, yeah, I don't see any kind of like, oh, if it weren't for this, I never would have written this song. Although on my solo album, Priddle Concern, I had this little fade out thing. I stole that from a Joe Walsh album, not this album, but
Yeah.
things like that. I like having references like that.
Yeah, so let's just dive right into the first album then. So we have Bob Dylan, Highway 61 Revisited. This comes out in 1965. Bob Dylan, one of the greatest artists of all time. Just in his discography, he's released 4 or 5 of the all-time great albums. So why specifically this album out of his amazing discography? I mean, you could easily choose 3, 4, 5 other ones, and they hold up.
I mean, Blonde on Blonde, Blood on the Tracks, Time Out of Mind, 1977. I still say the greatest comeback album of all time. To me, that album it's as if Wayne Gretzky came out of retirement this season and scored 100 goals. I think everything came together on Highway 61. Bring it all back home. The previous album was the first electric album, but the acoustic side was better than the electric side. This was all electric. I read a thing about I read a quote by Phil Ramone, who produced Blood on the Tracks, and he said, yeah, the thing about claiming to produce Bob Dylan, you don't really produce Bob Dylan. Like, producing Bob Dylan means you press record all the time, because Dylan doesn't care. He gets in the studio, he sings his songs. It doesn't matter who's with him. But they've got to be good, because he's going to change everything. He's going to, like, oh, I'm going to wait 4 bars instead of 2 bars between these verses, and you got to be on your toes. I read this amazing thing about his gospel period. He made Slow Train Coming, and then he made 2 more records. The next record, I believe, was Shot of Love. Same producer, same musician, same studio, but Shot of Love sounds terrible. Slow Train Coming sounds amazing. It sounds like a Steely Dan album. Apparently, he went to the mixing and said, "What are you doing?" And the producer said, "Well, we're mixing." And he said, "Why does it sound so clean?" The producer said, well, that's what we do. We clean up the tracks, we make them nicer, and then we mix it. He said, well, what did you play me last week? He said, those were the rough mixes. That's what I want.
And that's what he went with.
No one does that. So this was, like you said, released August 30th, 1965. The sessions ended on like August 25th. It's just, you don't have to, obviously I wasn't around in 1965 to hear this when it was released, but it doesn't matter when you listen to this, you can hear that it's going somewhere that no one's ever gone before. There's a sense of chaos in so many songs, like it's something's about to blow up, and sometimes you think it would be a sort of unbearable ecstasy to be one of the session players, because you're doing something so amazing and you're only going to get 2 or 3 takes or 1 take, and you better make it count, and they all count. I mean, I've regularly covered 6 of these songs, and they just, the sonic space is unbelievable. A song like Just Like Tom Thumb's Blues, it's got in the center, slightly left, it's got this electric guitar played by Mike Bloomfield. On the left is a vibrato Hofner electric piano, and on the right is what's called a tack piano, when you put things on the piano strings to be, it's like a old barrel house Western, and it all comes together in this beautiful, and then the snare hits, and it's, the snare sound on the entire record is just like the sound of God. It's just, I think it's in 1965, it was hard to go into a good studio and make something bad. All the gear was great. I think that was kind of the peak of the, people weren't really messing with things. They were just trying to document things, but it got to the point where it was more than just a document. And it was before, when you were like deliberately trying to mess with things and start doing effects. And so, I don't know, it just all, it's like people say about recording Dylan, it's catching lightning in a bottle.
It's just capturing magic and trying to get like a kind of an audio timestamp of the performance, essentially, instead of all the editing and manipulating later on that we do here with technology.
And this was, and maybe the sound of chaos comes from the fact that this was his 3rd album in 18 months. He'd been on the road constantly. He was probably doing way too much amphetamine, probably drinking too much and smoking tons of weed. And he basically took himself out after this album. It was too much, and you can hear it. But at the same time, he's just at the top of his form. And which brings me to the next thing. I don't know what I hate worse, when people, if you're a musician or a music lover, you can't say, no, I don't like Bob Dylan. You can't do it. So I don't know what's worth, people that say, oh, I can't stand Bob Dylan, or people that say, oh, I respect him and he's a great writer, but I can't listen to his voice. You listen to the beginning of Desolation Row and you tell me this guy can't sing. I think it was Jeff Tweedy from Wilco that said, you'll never find a singer who thinks Bob Dylan is a bad singer. I mean, it's hard to overestimate Bob Dylan. I would say calling him the greatest songwriter in history is underselling him a bit.
Wow.
And calling him a great lyric writer, he's got a chip on his shoulder about that, and he should, because it means, oh, so I can't sing, I'm not a melodicist, I can't write songs, I'm just good for words. I mean, his phrasing wise, his peers are Miles Davis and Frank Sinatra. He's, without irony, I call him the greatest singer of our generation.
Yeah, it's. I think I've heard Dave Grohl say that if you have a voice, the most important thing is that you have something to say and that you're unique and distinct. So with Bob Dylan, it's like no, he doesn't have like the typical beautiful like Mariah Carey voice or whatever, but it's like he has the voice he was given, and it's Bob Dylan, and he uses it masterfully for what it is and for his craft.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's
it's things don't exist in a vacuum. You put together amazing lyrics, amazing songs, an amazing band, amazing equipment, and an amazing singer, you're going to come up with Highway 61.
You were saying that he's quite possibly the greatest songwriter of all time. If he is not the greatest songwriter of all time, who's in the running? I guess it would be Lennon, McCartney, maybe Neil Young. Like who's in the Mount Rushmore
Uh,
with Bob Dylan?
uh, Chris Christopherson, I would say, Leonard Cohen. It depends. Some are great lyricists, some are great. Sting is a great melodicist, but that's about it. Um, McCartney is a great melodicist. Dylan's the whole package.
Do you remember the first time that you really got into Bob Dylan's music? I mean, the music was out there, but at what point did it really stand out to you?
Yeah, I didn't hear much of it at all growing up. I was introduced to it by the first friend I made in first year university in at Queens and Kingston, and it was probably Greatest Hits Volume 2. And then from there I just got into a wormhole. My friend had a lot of I don't think I heard Highway 61 at that point. I was mostly into the early acoustic ones. And the thing I remember most often, I was going to ask you earlier, cussing is okay, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I got asked that last interview. Hey, if you need to cuss to properly get across the emotions that, go ahead.
So I remember so vividly listening to something from, let's say, Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll from Times Are Changing, and lifting the needle going, what the fuck did he just say? I have to hear that again. What is that? Can that be what he said?
It was just so different or
It was just
shocking or
so
beautiful.
intense and arresting.
So for our listeners that maybe aren't familiar with that album yet, that's the best part of this whole series is people going out and getting 5 great albums at a time to dive into. So the 4 singles were Like a Rolling Stone, which is the Bob Dylan song everyone knows, From a Buick 6, Highway 61 Revisited, and Queen Jane Approximately. Yeah, this album, it's one of the most acclaimed albums of all time. There's the famous Rolling Stone list, 500 greatest albums of all time. This is at number 4. Like of all the albums in human history, it's in the top 5 to show just how incredible it is.
Yeah, and I mean, the calling songs singles is kind of irrelevant to me, and they're just all so incredible in their own way. Desolation Row, I don't know,
That's the final song, right? And it's
13
like
or 14
11
or
minutes.
15 minutes. Dylan's playing an acoustic guitar, someone else is playing acoustic guitar, fills perfectly. The harmonica solo at the end is like stupidly too loud, but you wouldn't want it any less loud. It just kind of makes your head explode. It's kind of this, he just sings and sings and sings, and then the harmonica is this incredible release valve that just blows the top of your head off. From a Buick 6 just has this that chaotic sound. It just sounds like it's falling apart. Al Cooper's doing this organ fill that just keeps repeating and repeating and repeating. It just and it's funny too. What's the line in Buick 6? She don't make me nervous. She don't talk too much. She walks like Bo Diddley, and she don't need no crutch. She keeps this 410 all loaded with lead. I
Yeah.
think when I was thinking about these 5 albums, there's a sense of humor running through all of them.
I was gonna say that with it was either Steely Dan or the let's see, what are the other, the Joe Walsh. One of those two had some comedy stuff going on in there, or at least a sense of humor.
Yeah, yeah, but also a deadly serious at the same time, which I think is a lot of what I love about music.
I love that Bob Dylan isn't in a rush. Like songs
Yeah,
like a Rolling Stone and Desolation Row. It's like it's going to take as long as it needs to take to get his point across.
yeah. Well, and that's the thing when you have these when you move from like 3 verses in a bridge to like 6 verses, 7 verses, 8 verses, they're constructed so well. Bob Dylan's a great storyteller, and you start to see patterns, and the finishing. It's always the most intense lines in the finishing verse.
Yeah, let me know if I'm incorrect with the following statement, but my understanding is before Bob Dylan, lyrics and music were like, tutti frutti all a Rudy, like they meant nothing. It was just something had to come out. There was a melody, and here's a few words, and it's like, I don't know, we dance to this and it feels good. And my understanding is Bob Dylan is where it's like lyrics became actual, of the utmost importance, and telling a story, and he becomes the voice of a generation because there's something worth
Yeah.
saying. Is that accurate, or am I
I
off?
think that's quite accurate. David Crosby said when the Byrds one of their first singles was Mr. Tambourine Man, and he said that was the first time poetry was on the radio.
Wow. Okay, I have a story here. You mentioned that Bob Dylan, he was just touring constantly. He just putting out so many albums that he was kind of burning out. So there's a quick story about him getting burnt out just before the writing of Like a Rolling Stone. I thought you would enjoy. So it says here, in May of 1965, Dylan returned from his tour of England feeling exhausted and dissatisfied with his material. He told journalist Nat Hentoff, "I was going to quit singing. I was very drained. It's very tiring having other people tell you how much they dig you if you don't dig yourself." Then he says, as a consequence of his dissatisfaction, Dylan wrote 20 pages of verse he later described as a long piece of vomit. He reduced this to a song with 4 verses and a chorus, which became Like a Rolling Stone. He told Hentoff that writing and recording the song washed away his dissatisfaction and restored his enthusiasm for creating music. Describing the experience, Dylan said, "It's like a ghost is writing a song like that. You don't know what it means, except the ghost picked me to write that song." So that's Like a Rolling Stone. Crazy, eh? He just writes
Yeah.
20 pages and narrows it down to essentially the greatest song of all time.
Well, and the further background of that is on that tour of the UK, he was getting booed every night. Like everyone, the 80% of the crowd was booing him and yelling at him during the Electric set. And who else could say, I don't care what you think, I'm going to keep doing this.
Until they come around.
Yeah.
It's wild. I watched the movie. I think it was No Direction Home. It's like
Yeah.
3.5 hours. Like, it's so long. I started and I didn't realize how long and intense it was. But man, that paints a picture of him going through that phase of going from the electric or the
Yeah.
acoustic to electric, and all the backlash and people throwing stuff and walking out. And you think to today, where there's so many styles of music, and artists are known for going across genres, and it's all normal now. And you think of what Bob Dylan went through, and you think of today, and it's like, that stuff never happens today. It's all accepted. And I guess a part of it is he was kind of the genius ahead of his time that had to, take the brunt of I guess working in crowds to expect that and be okay with it. And we benefit from that now as musicians.
Well, yeah, he invented everything. He invented country rock. You could say he invented folk rock. He put Tin Pan Alley out of business. Before Dylan, no one's sang their own songs. everyone, like, there were songwriters and there were singers, and after Dylan, it was like, oh, we got to be like Dylan, we got to write our own songs.
So like a Rolling Stone comes out, top 10 hit in a bunch of different countries. I mentioned Rolling Stone with the 500 greatest albums of all time. They also had the 500 greatest songs of all time, like a Rolling Stone, top 5 again. He had 2 other songs from this album on that list. So Desolation Row and Highway 61 Revisited. They were number 187 and 373. So he has, just from one album, not his entire discography, from one album, 3 of the greatest songs of all time. I think there's only like 8 songs on the album as well, right? It's a shorter album.
9 songs, yeah.
9 songs. Okay. Another song that stood out to me was Ballad of a Thin Man. Just there's such like a groove and like a pocket and intensity. There's like attitude. I can like feel attitude while I'm listening to this.
And he it's another, Dylan just doesn't follow rules. When I'm producing, I remember working on a song with someone and saying like, no, your chorus has to come up and your chorus can't come down and register. And that's what he does on Ballad of the Thin Man. He goes up and up and up in the verse, and then he brings it down. And it's like, you're not allowed to do that. But if you're Dylan, you don't have to follow any rules, because you're making up new rules as you go along.
They apparently, him naming the album Highway 61 Revisited, I don't know why, but the label didn't like it. And it's like he wanted to name it that, and whoever at the lower end of the label spectrum was like, no, we can't do that. So he goes someone higher, and apparently he fought all the way up to the top. And at the top, they're like, just let him fucking name it whatever he wants. And it's like a famous story with the album. I mean, who, it's not like that's a ridiculous name of an album. It's not something, someone else, Alf Annabellini of Envy of None, he had in his top 5, he had an album by Sparkle Horse. And the name of the album is like Viva Dixie Marine Submarine. It's literally like the entire alphabet. So anyways, Bob Dylan, Highway 61 Revisited, that's like a nice title, but label people,
weird. Like, you got to remember, Pet Sounds, Beach Boys, they wouldn't let him call the song Hang On to Your Ego. He had to change it to I Know There's an Answer. He said, oh, people can't handle that.
It's wild.
It was olden times.
Did you ever get to see Bob Dylan live?
Once I saw him, the Tempest tour. I was just talking to Colin Linden about this. He was playing with Dylan the summer before I saw that tour, and it was one of the most amazing shows I've ever seen. It sounded perfect. I was in the nosebleeds at the I don't know if it's still called the Sony Center, the old opera house in Toronto, and it was mind blowing. I know this guy from he's an old folk guy, and in the most humble way, he told me, we were talking about the show, and he said, well, I'm not going to get into it, but I'm on the list for every Dylan show, so I go to every show. He said, maybe if it's the Sky Dome, I don't go to that show. And he said, and that one was top 5.
Wow.
So I got lucky. It was one of those shows where I wish it could have gone on for 12 hours, because I was never not in awe of it. I could have just gone on listening to every little detail forever.
He had you captivated.
Yeah.
Yeah. You hear that, some of the later shows, closer to now, apparently like his voice isn't holding up so great. So I don't know if that's true or not, but it's awesome to hear that the show you were at, everything was just incredible.
It was definitely the late period voice, but I remember it as he sounded a little better than on the last album, the album that he was touring. It was just, it was stunning.
So I've seen that in the past, you've actually done gigs where you were covering the entire Blood on the Tracks album from Bob Dylan. Is that true? And if so, will you ever bring that back where we can come out and see a full Bob Dylan album perform?
Yeah, I'm hoping to do it in the fall here in Sault Ste. Marie with a local stand-up bass player named Jay Case, who's kind of like a legend around here. Just the two of us, with open tuning acoustic and a stand-up bass.
That would be amazing. I got to get out to Sault Ste. Marie. How far is that from Ottawa? Any idea?
And 9.5 hours.
So you're saying there's a chance. It is possible to
Possible.
physically get there. I have just two reviews. So some great reviews that came out about the album, and then we can move on to the next album. So first review. So Michael Gray calls Highway 61 revolutionary and stunning, not just for its energy and panache, but in its vision. Fusing radical electrical music with lyrics that were light years ahead of anyone else's. Dylan here unites the force of blues-based rock and roll with the power of poetry, the whole rock culture, the whole post-Beatle pop rock world. And so in an important sense, the 1960s actually started here with this album. So that's one quote. And then the other one is music journalist Gary Graff points to Highway 61 Revisited along with Dylan's next album, Blonde on Blonde, and the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds as possible starting points to the album era, as they each constituted a cohesive and conceptual body of work rather than just some hit singles with filler tracks. So that's what you're saying. Suddenly there's artists that have a whole album's worth of songs.
No, that's absolutely true. There's not many albums before 1965 that are notable. That I would say the early Stones albums are pretty awesome. I wouldn't say that about the early Beatles albums. Even the Kinks, they kind of started their run of great albums in 1965. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how it was the music industry. It was a singles thing, and then you have artists like the Beatles and Bob Dylan that have a full album's worth of music. And hey, a label can make more money selling an album than it can singles. And we went as with an album kind of business model for a long time. And then when the illegal downloading and the Napsters and now the streaming, it seems like we're kind of more back in a singles world. Do you see it that way as well? Like we just came back to what it was pre-Beatles and Dylan?
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know if I think there's still people that are into albums. I think part of it is it's just a shrinking audience for music in general. So I think there's always a core section of people that are really into music, and those people are always going to be into albums. And the music business is in rough shape right now, so there's not as many great records being made, and that's part of it keeps eating itself. And so I think young people are listening to old albums and realizing, wow, these are great. Like you'd be crazy not to listen to this whole thing.
So if you think the audience for music is shrinking, where do you think these people are going? Are they're getting more into video games or getting it? What do you think?
Yeah, things like that. It's
Okay.
just not a big part of the culture anymore.
I guess it's the face and the tablets and the phones that there's, mobile games and social media. I guess that's cutting into music time.
Corporations have devalued music. It's to be a pop star today, you need two things. You need to be really good looking and you need to play along. That's it. You don't need to sing. They can fix that. You just need to be willing to be a commodity.
That's funny. Yeah. Singing is optional for a singer now with technology. Yeah. I remember seeing this thing that went viral, and it was something along the lines of, I don't know, a band will spend all this money in the studio and the record labels and they would spend all this time and they get everything down to, there's a single you can buy for $1 and people aren't paying for it. And they'll go out every day and get a $5 Starbucks coffee, but they won't, the coffee costs the company nothing to make. And then there's this album that people spent $100,000 on or more, and you won't spend $1. It's the devaluation of music, like you mentioned. It's sad. Do you ever cry at night, Bill, when you think about this stuff?
Well, sometimes.
we all do. Let's dive into the next album. So you're the second album on your top 5 list, Steely Dan, The Royal Scam. This comes out.
We're gonna go chronological. So we're gonna go Joe Walsh.
Joe Walsh. Hey, you're the boss here. So Joe Walsh, 1973, The Smoker You Drink, The Player You Get. That's a pretty awesome album title. Can you talk about the album title at all? It's a play on words, right?
Yeah, apparently it refers to the higher you get, the better you sound. which was
Okay.
definitely Joe Walsh's MO back in the early 70s. I'm going to preface this by telling a story that starts with Steely Dan. When I was 14 or 15, I went to a prayer group every Wednesday night with my older sister. And what I liked about this was that I brought my guitar and I would sing and play. That was the first time I'd ever done that. And a guy at the prayer group lent me Steely Dan Asia. I never gave it back. I became obsessed with Steely Dan. Maybe the next summer, I'm not sure if it was 77 or 78, when Van Halen released their first album. And our family went on a trip to Toronto in the summer. And I went to Sam the Record Man. And because I had Steely Dan Asia, I had the first album, which Can't Buy a Thrill, because it had a couple singles on it. So it was available in Sault Ste. Marie record stores, but the other albums were not available. So I went down with the intention of buying all those. So I bought Countdown to Ecstasy, Pretzel Logic, Katie Lied, and The Royal Scam. And so the Van Halen album had come out in March, and in May or June, it was Running with the Devil was all over the radio. And I couldn't get enough of this song. I was just obsessed with it. So I bought those 4 Steely Dan albums, the first Van Halen record, and my older sister said, "Will you buy me The Smoker You Drink, The Player Get?" I'm like, okay, whatever. So I got those 6 albums. I came home. I listened to Van Halen just all the time for 2 weeks. And then I came to the realization, I'm kind of sick of Running with the Devil. I kind of don't want to hear Van Halen ever again in my entire life. Whereas those other 5 records, if I'm anywhere and you put any of those songs on, I'm going to go, oh my God, this is amazing. They still just, I mean, this is a strange one. The Smoker You Drink, The Player You Get. Joe Walsh was not a solo guy. He did not want to be Joe Walsh. He wanted to be in a band. And this album shows. His drummer, Joe Vitale, was a singer and a songwriter and a flute player. His flute is all over this and a bunch of the Joe Walsh albums. His bass player, Ken Passarelli, he sings lead on one. Vitale sings lead on 2. And it's Rocky Mountain Way is the single, and that's about it for rock music. It's a very mellow, dreamy, it's just kind of my thing. It's very relaxing and hypnotic and heartfelt, and it's just got so many beautiful passages, and the sequencing is great. The when it goes from Midnight Moody's into Happy Ways with this snappy Latin tinged bass line, and and Everywhere is Joe Walsh's amazing voice and his amazing slide guitar, and yeah, it's just the song Wolf, the third song, it's just, I think, an acoustic guitar and his electric guitar, and it's just this amazing soundscape.
I was actually really impressed with this album. I like you mentioned, it's musically it gives you a lot. Like, it gives you a lot of variety. It's not like every song is Rocky Mountain Way. It's such a variety, and it's probably because you mentioned all the different members that are in there, and it's different people singing and different people writing. And I guess all those members were in a band at the time, and for some reason this was labeled as his solo album, even though it was kind of a band effort.
Yeah,
And
kind
I
of
hear that there was a
Barnes
falling out over that it's actually part of why the actual band broke up and he continued solo.
right. Well, he kept going with Joe Vitale because Joe Vitale's all over But Seriously Folks as well, which is also a fine album. Yeah, it's just I just have a special kinship with Joe Walsh. We kind of have a similar nasally voice, and everything he does is tasteful. He's a great guitar player, but he's not flashy at all. He shows so much. He never shreds. I don't think there's any Joe Walsh solo where he just it's always taste and holding notes and emotion. And
so this was his second solo album, but this was the big commercial breakthrough, right? Because of Rocky Mountain Way. That was a big hit. The album was a big hit, goes gold. I have the story of how he wrote Rocky Mountain Way, if you want to hear it. It's interesting. Sure. So Joe Walsh says, I'm living in Colorado and I'm mowing the lawn. I look up and there's the front range of the Rocky Mountains and there's snow on them in the summer. And it knocked me back because it was just beautiful. And I thought, I guess I'm committed to being here. I'm in Colorado and the Rocky Mountain Way is the better way than I had before. And then he goes, bam, I got the lyrics. So it was just kind of in a moment of awe and the beauty of the mountains, the Rocky Mountain Way. So it just came to him. So it's kind of cool. Yeah, the moral of the story is you should be mowing the lawn. If it needs to be mowed, get out there and do it.
And Joe Walsh is a total down-to-earth everyman guy. I came upon this fan site of Joe Walsh, and it was written by this guy that worked on an Eagles show. He was a local crew. So he gets to the show and he says, some roadie comes up to me and says, hey, would you like to, will you go get me some strings? And gave him a list. He went to the music store. He's chatting with this guy. And the whole time he's assuming he's a roadie, because a guy from the Eagles would not be talking to me like this. And then the show starts, oh, it's Joe Walsh. That's the kind of guy he was. There was no, I'm the rock star, you're the local crew.
There's a story here of how they got the sound for the guitars in Rocky Mountain Way. So apparently it's just like 6 or 7 guitars that he layered. They're just using a Shure SM57 microphone. And I guess the engineer, the producer said that thick guitar sound is just from Walsh himself. There's no studio trickery done afterwards. So just layering guitar upon guitar.
Yeah. Bill's Simzik. Yeah.
I saw the name and I just said, I don't know the engineer. I didn't want to try to pronounce that.
The other thing about this record is, and I wish I still had the album, or I wish I had someone else's vinyl copy, because I swear something went wrong in the mastering, and it had this 6K, 7K, 8K sheen to it that was over the top, which was fine by me because that's the reason it's called Treble Charger. I love treble. I'm pretty sure like he was drunk in the mastering session and kept saying, no, it needs to turn up the high end. I can't hear. Because it really was, I mean, it didn't detract from the album, but it had this, it was almost like that flowed through everything. You don't hear it on the master, the MP3s or whatever now, but
they've gone back and remastered it, you think? Or
I would think so, yeah.
That's funny. They shaved off the high piercing mosquito frequencies that were in there. That's funny. So a little Eagles trivia here. I guess when the Eagles went back out on tour for the Long Road Out of Eden tour, when they did the encore, they always did 3 songs. So they had Desperado and Take It Easy, and they would play Rocky Mountain Way. That was in the Eagles encore.
Yeah. Yeah, Joe Walsh is he's a very underrated songwriter. I would say Pretty Maids in a Row is easily the best song from Hotel California. In the City's another great Joe Walsh Eagles song. Bob Dylan loves Pretty Maids All in a Row. When I read that, I was like, vindication.
That's awesome. So I have a few words from critics, and then we can move on to the next album. So AllMusic says, Walsh's ability to swing wildly from one end of the rock scale to the other is unparalleled and makes for an album to suit many tastes. It features some of the most remembered Joe Walsh tracks, But it's not just these that make the album a success. Each of the 9 tracks is a song to be proud of. This is a superb album by anyone's standard. So from All Music. So
Yep.
what album do we dive into next? We're going chronologically. So are we back to Steely Dan?
Yep.
In 69. All right. So album number 3, Steely Dan, The Royal Scam, 1969. Why does this one mean so much to you?
1976.
What did I say? 69?
Yep.
1976. There you go.
Yeah.
1976.
So Steely Dan, they made 6 albums. I'm not counting their reunion albums in the 90s. They made 6 albums. The first one they were a record company creation. They got these guys together, put them with some other guys. This lead singer who was only on the first album sang 3 or 4 songs on the first album. And then so that was Can't Buy a Thrill. The last one was Gaucho. To me, they do what no band, with the exception of Pavement, the 90s band that I mentioned earlier, this 6 album run is just, there's no bad songs, which is, no one does that. You know, some people, some really great artists can manage that in a span of however many albums, but at a certain point they're like, oh well, there's a bit of filler on this. Steely Dan, every song is great. There's just no songs that you could possibly call bad. The songs are so well put together. They were like the Beatles. They stopped touring and just recorded. After the first 2 records, they dispensed with the idea of a regular band and just had session players. They would work on a song for 2 days and then they would say, no, it's not working. Everyone out, and they would bring in a whole new band and start over. They would Rick Derringer talks about, I worked on this solo for 12 hours. They didn't keep it. You know, just, and for a guitar player, there is every single guitar solo on a Steely Dan song is one of the greatest guitar solos ever. There's just something about it. They just knew how to make records. They had great taste. You know, they were jazz guys that hated rock and roll until the Beatles. They were cynical New York guys. They were, you know, if you look on video of Reelin' in the Years, say on the Midnight Special or something, you see everyone in the band, especially the lead singer. He's like the prototype lead singer. He's tall, he's got long hair, he's got a ridiculous outfit on, sort of like Robert Plantish, you know, bell bottoms and the
total rock star
tie-dye shirt, and you know, he looks like he's going to be out of fashion in about 7 months. And Donald Fagen and Walter Becker are wearing suit jackets and nice shoes and vests, and they look like they're going to be fashionable in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 30 years from now. And that to me says so much about what Steely Dan is.
So my dad is a Steely Dan fan, and my whole life I've basically heard, if you're a guitarist, you should love Steely Dan. It's like the guitarist's band, essentially.
Yeah.
And there's 5 different guitarists playing on this album to show, you know, how much guitar wizardry is going on. And, you know, sometimes you think in an entire album, there might be a few tasty solos or riffs. I was essentially in every single song, there was 2 or 3 or 4 amazing, intricate guitar parts, whether it's a solo here.
Like, wow, like what's going on?
Yeah, it's like they approach songwriting differently. You know, it's like it wasn't, you know, you think Bob Dylan, where it's like there's the story being told essentially, and it felt like this. It's just like world-class musicians. Like, how can we make great music? You know, there will be lyrics, there will be vocals, but it's just incredible world-class musicianship documented across several songs on an album. That's what I got out of it.
Yeah, and the other thing for me is like I love Steely Dan is like by far my favorite 70s band, one of my favorite bands of all time. Like I said, all their albums are great. Um, there's probably a good handful of Steely Dan songs from other albums that I like better than any of the songs on this album, but everything came together. This is just a great listening experience from start to finish. It just flows really well. It yeah. And you said it's a guitar player's, if you're a guitar player like Steely Dan, well, you could say the same thing about drums for sure, keyboards, the horn arrangements, bass, whatever. Everything is perfect. I don't think anyone did so well with overthinking than Steely Dan. A lot of artists they overthink too much and that things get watered down, but that doesn't seem to happen with Steely Dan. They just know, they're just great editors. They and listeners.
Yeah, the harmonies also really jumped out to me. When they get
Yeah.
to the choruses, there's these incredible harmonies. Is that what they were also known for?
Yeah, because they were very like jazz harmonies. Michael McDonald, that sang on most of these albums, he talks about on Peg from Asia, like it was really difficult because the notes are so close together, and that's really difficult to sing when you're one note is here and one note is this close to hear both, and so that it was just harmony. Like I've always been a good harmony arranger and able to listen to something and tease out the harmonies, but it's very difficult with Steely Dan. And it's very difficult to learn these songs. I'm trying to learn, it's kind of teaching me jazz, trying to learn Steely Dan songs.
So
Because
Asia would be the most commercially successful of the Steely Dan albums,
yeah,
right?
yeah, and it was the one after this.
Okay, this one led to that one. This one was still top 15, went gold, 3 different singles, so still successful. But the
Yeah,
next one was the juggernaut.
yeah, but I mean, I never heard any of these songs on the radio for sure. I mean, it was up in Sault Ste. Marie, but even like we had a good album, freeform album FM station across the river, and they would play a little bit of Steely Dan, but it just, like I said, yeah, Bernard Purdy plays drums on most of it. Larry Carlton plays a lot of guitar. There's just so many. When I look at the track listing, every song has something amazing happening. Whether it's Sign In Stranger has this like stinky guitar by Elliot Randall, and then at the end it goes into this incredible horn arrangement coda that just kind of blows the roof off and just takes the song in a completely different direction. The I ran across this great quote from Walter Becker about the song "The Fez," because the piano player Paul Griffin played on it, and he's the only person to ever have a Steely Dan co-write. And Walter Becker said, "There's an instrumental melody that Paul started playing in the session, and when we decided to build that melody up to a greater position, since we had some suspicion that perhaps this melody wasn't entirely Paul's invention, we decided to give him composer credit in case later some sort of scandal developed and he would take the brunt of the impact."
It's a good business move.
That sums up Steely Dan's like cynical, dry sense of humor.
Yeah, the same song, the Fez. I've never heard this before, but the Fez refers to a condom. Have you ever heard of a condom
Yeah.
called the Fez, or is it this song that popularized that?
No, I think it was just like a bit the hat being
Okay. So so yeah, they say the Fez, the composition was explained as a cheerful ode to the importance of always wearing a condom. Yeah, and the lyrics say, "I'm never gonna do it without the Fez on." So that's the humor that I kept hearing throughout the album.
absolutely.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the lore of the band, but apparently the Royal Scam is littered with cryptic allusions to people and events, both real and fictional. Is that something across all their albums? There's all these cryptic things going on, and like 20 years later in an interview, they'll say, "Oh, they'll give you more hints of what's going on."
There's always they're kind of like Lou Reed in that kind of like non-judge. Well, Lou Reed was famously talking about underground characters in a non-judgmental way. Steely Dan, there's definitely some judgment, but there's always it's always drug dealers and people getting wasted and I mean I remember 16-year-old me being obsessed with the title track The Royal Scam and figuring out that it was about Puerto Ricans, and it was like putting together a puzzle, like, oh, St. John, that's the capital of Puerto Rico, that's what they're talking about, and just having this sense of I'm discovering something very important here.
That's what it's like when I listen to albums from Nine Inch Nails or Tool. There's like all this cryptic stuff. You're trying to decode what the lyrics mean, and the Fibonacci sequence and all these famous things with both bands. When I first played the album, so the first single, Kid Charlemagne, I think it's the first song on the album as well that kicks off the album.
Yep.
When it came on right away, I knew the song, but not from them. And I don't know if you're a Kanye West fan, but on his third album, so the song is called Champion. There's a Kanye West song called Champion on the third album, Graduation, considered one of the greatest albums of all time. And it samples Kid Charlemagne. So that's why I actually knew the song already.
Right, of course.
And just to double check that I'm not crazy, I went to the credits, the Kanye West credits, and it's credited to West, Walter Becker, and Donald Fagen on that song. So little boost from Kanye West.
Black Cow was sampled for another hip hop song.
Okay. And then going through, so I just have notes on a few songs on the album. I went through and listened to the 5 albums that you chose. So The Caves of Altamira, I put the great harmonies in the chorus, delicious sax and horn section playing in the final third of the song. Man, it's so tasty. Whatever's going on.
Were so, everything they did was perfect. They didn't make any missteps somehow. They worked until it, and this was the album before Katie Lied was one of the first albums to use the DBX system, which was a way of having more dynamic range and less noise, and something went wrong. So they were just, I mean, it doesn't sound great, but it doesn't sound terrible, but they thought it was the end of the world. That this was just like they had to like hang their heads in shame that they put out this piece of garbage because something went wrong with the technology. They were that obsessed. And Gaucho, one of the reasons it took so long is it was one of the first kind of proto Pro Tools thing where they could actually edit the drums. And then once that can of worms was open, it was like, oh well, there's another 7 months right there. They just worked until they got it right, and it always ended up right. And at the same time, they were, lyrically, it was just, they were so cynical and brilliant. The song Haitian Divorce, in the bridge ends with, it's a story song about a woman getting a divorce because back then you could go to some place and get an easy no fault divorce if you went to Haiti or Bahamas.
Does this place still exist? I mean, this could come in candy for people.
I'm not sure. Yeah, because with Reno was the same thing. You'd go to Las Vegas. There's different laws, and so the marriage goes south, and this woman goes to Haiti, and she meets up with someone, and then at the end. And the bridge kind of everything's cinematic with Steely Dan. They tell the story in the first verse, and then the bridge kind of advances the plot, and then the end of the bridge says, "Now we dolly back, now we fade to black." And then the next verse is cheerful reunion in the U.S. It's that dollying back and fade, like an old movie. It's like wrapping up the narrative, and here we're going to present day. Everything was on so many levels with them.
So visual.
Yeah.
Wow. I have notes for 2 songs. So Don't Take Me Alive, I put a super tasty guitar solo to start the song, and the bass playing is amazing. And then Sign In Stranger, I put great piano playing. The solo at the end of the song is super melodic. So I was I think this I think the Steely Dan album, The Royal Scam, I think that's my favorite of the 5 albums. Just front to back, just taking it all in. And maybe because I'm a guitarist, it just felt so good. The guitars, so yes, what they're playing is incredible, but it's not like they're showing off like in a thrash metal band. It's just such unbelievable guitar playing. Just
Yeah.
the tones they're getting and what they're playing, and you can hear it's in different styles and genres, and it sounds like they could play anything.
Yeah. Well, the Don't Take Me Alive is the famous impossible chord that Larry Carlton plays. It's extremely difficult to play the whole chord. So he plays it slow, strums this chord, and then it just feeds back into this like flawless feedback right into the solo, like you say. And that was, Larry Carlton, his ES 335, and I heard a story about he was working on a later Donald Fagen solo album, and he came to New York, and he had his guitar, and Fagen said, "Where's your amp?" Because he had a Tweed Deluxe amp, and that was part of his sound. He said, "Well, it's New York. I figured we could rent one just as good." Fagen said, "No, ship the amp. We need that. We need that amp." And it's just, Larry Carlton said, someone asked him, "What's your sound?" He said, I turn it up until it barks." There's a lot of barking going on in this album.
That's funny. That's funny. The impossible chord, you need 6 fingers to play it or something. I have, man, the Eagles keep coming up across these albums, but for the song Everything You Did, so a lyric says, "Turn up the Eagles, the neighbors are listening." And the story behind that, Glenn Frey of the Eagles said, apparently Walter Becker's girlfriend loved the Eagles and she played them all the time. I think it drove him nuts. So the story goes that they were having a fight one day, and that was the genesis of the line. And then it says, given that the two bands shared a manager and that the Eagles proclaimed their admiration for Steely Dan, it was more of a friendly rivalry than a feud. And then to return the favor for Steely Dan saying the Eagles in their lyrics, later that year, in a nod back to Steely Dan for the free publicity, it inspired Steely Dan's. So it's the Eagles pen the lyrics. They stab it with their steely knives, but they just can't kill the bee. So it's like one of the most famous lines in songs ever. Hotel California. Frey commented, "We just wanted to allude to Steely Dan rather than mentioning them outright. So Dan got changed to knives, which is still, a penile metaphor." So
Yeah.
I don't know. The Eagles are running through all your albums here. It's
Yeah. Well, and do you know about the birth of the name Steely Dan?
I don't know.
It's William S. Burroughs, the very strange writer. One of my favorite writers is his book novel Naked Lunch, which is not so much a novel as just a bunch of stream of consciousness weirdness. And in one of the rare narrative parts of it, one character has this dildo called Steely Dan, which is essentially a knife.
Oh my God. Oh, this band. There's so much stuff going on here.
Yeah.
What my favorite thing from the Eagles, well, besides all the incredible music, is the story of, I guess at some point they were kind of broken up or weren't touring or things weren't going well. And someone asked them, "When are you guys going to tour again?" And they said, "When Hell Freezes Over." And then years later, they're on tour and it's the Hell Freezes Over tour. I thought that was like the most amazing thing ever.
Yeah.
What else we got? I got one more thing here. So about the album cover, again, this is their sense of humor. So the album cover shows a man in a suit sleeping on a radiator and dreaming of skyscraper beast hybrids. Fagen and Becker claim it to be the most hideous album cover of the 70s, bar none, excepting perhaps their own album, Can't Buy a Thrill. So they in their own opinion, they have two of the ugliest album covers of all time.
Well, that's another thing I love about Steely Dan. They are not full. They may be full of themselves, but they also hate themselves. So to me, that's what every great musician is, a combination of incredible ego and incredible self-loathing.
The dichotomy, the walking contradiction within the own band here. What's strange is, I just listened to the album for the first time, and it's incredible. I loved it. Surprisingly, it actually didn't received great reviews when it came out, and then retrospectively it's very well looked upon, and it's on the list of the 100 greatest the all-time 1,000 albums from Colin Larkin, I guess, as a music critic. It's a famous list. So yeah, sometimes albums are ahead of their time, and it takes time to catch up.
Yep. Yeah, it's like Highway 61.
There you go. I was shocked to see that the band, I knew they were popular, but they've sold over 40 million albums, which is wild. That's what, one of the best-selling bands of all time.
It's really amazing because one of the things that, the 70s was just an incredible decade for music. There was so much going on. And what I think one of the things that makes the 70s for me the best decade of music is you have these bands that in any other time are niche alternative bands, that they're getting giant big label budgets to make great records like this one.
Yeah, I was going to say that with there's 2 more albums. We're going to dive into Talking Heads. I would say it's the same thing with that band. Like, they're so unique and strange, and it seems like at a different point in time they wouldn't have broken through like they did. I was shocked at how popular they were as well, with the strangeness of their music. So I have 2 points left about Steely Dan, and then we'll move on. So VH1 ranked Steely Dan at number 82 on their list of the 100 greatest musical artists of all time. And then Rolling Stone ranked them at number 15 on the list of 20 greatest duos of all time. And then I have 1 comment sent in for you from a fan. So this is on YouTube. A YouTube user named Random Thoughts said, "This man to me is a legend. Red is the best Canadian song ever." So just some kind words sent in there. Make us feel good here. Next album. So again, still going in order. So we'll flip over to Talking Heads, Fear of Music, 1979. This is your 4th choice. And I mentioned to you before we started this that you are the 5th person to do this new series, my 5 favorite albums. And this Talking Heads album is the 3rd album out of 5 people. 3 of you chose a Talking Heads album, which is, that to me, that's crazy. Of it could be the Beatles, it could be the Rolling Stones, it could be whoever. 3 Talking Heads albums, and all 3 are different albums to show you how great their discography is. So those albums.
I'm going to guess the other 2 are More Songs About Buildings and Food and Remain in Light.
So Remain in Light was David Bottrell, the producer. That was his choice. And then we have a different choice. Alf Annabellini from Envy of None. He went with the live album, Stop Making Sense. So I guess the live DVDs considered one of the greatest live performances of all time. And
I saw that tour. And I prefer the previous live album. The name of this band is Talking Heads.
Okay. What do you think makes it superior to Stop Making Sense?
Well, Stop Making Sense, the end of the 70s was bad for everyone. No one emerged unscathed by I always talk about music really, really died at the end of this. It was a perfect storm of badness. You had the corporatization of everything, which meant that radio was being bought up by stations, and there was no more DJs with taste that could play whatever they want. It was the corporations want this playlist, and you had the advent of digital gear, which was terrible. So everyone sounded the same in a bad way. You had the advent of video, which meant that looks were more important than previous. So better music got left by the wayside because you're not good looking enough. And then cocaine, I think,
the perfect storm.
And I would say Fear of Music is the perfect, not many albums were improved by cocaine, but this one definitely was, because it sounds urban and paranoid, and it's you enter a world in this album where, and it's Brian Eno's the producer. This is the middle of the 3 Talking Heads albums that he produced. I had the a serendipitous experience when I bought the reissue of More Songs About Buildings and Food, the previous album. Like, you hear a Talking Heads song from this Eno period, and you can't figure out what's going on. And there was a DVD of a live performance of one of the songs, and I clicked on the live performance, and I was like, oh, it's just this song is just the four guys. It's just drums, bass, this guitar, but you can't hear that in Eno's. He just soundscapes everything. And so
there's the way it's mixed. Do you think it's the way it's mixed that doesn't have
everything that he brings to the table, and everything that everyone brings to the table? It's just a really great confluence. David Byrne's weirdness. The other thing that strikes me very strangely about Talking Heads, because somehow I got into Talking Heads when I was in high school. I don't know who introduced me. They had no radio songs, but I knew this guy. I hung out with this football player, and we both loved Talking Heads. I love Talking Heads because it was weird and subversive and strange. He loved it because it was football practice, funky, get excited music, which was just so bizarre to me. But now I realize, the drummer is obsessed with James Brown. He's a metronome. He's a robot in the most awesome way. And there's obviously a giant African influence on this entire album, but also just like Highway 61, just the sound of the word awe, AWE. There was a piece in the New York Times a little while ago about it, and for me, one of my favorite things about listening to music is that sense of awe, that sense of what is going on right now. Like, I don't understand what's going on. This album just takes you into this sound space and just creates this world where it's not just four people in a room making music. It's something else. It takes you to a different place.
It's like a taste into the divine. It's like you get that with music or beauty or world-class achievements. There's that sense of awe of what is truly possible.
Yeah, and
we could all be more than we are. And
different music affects me in different ways. Some, like I would say, any of the mellow tracks on the Joe Walsh album, it starts and I go, oh, I sink into it, or like a nice slow Steely Dan song with a great groove. It's like, oh, I feel relaxed and perfect. But Fear of Music is more like awe. It's like, I don't understand what's going on. I'm in awe. I'm confused in an amazing way.
How important do you think Brian Eno was to the band to help them in the studio, to get their confidence in the studio, to help them actually pull off? They have such grandiose ideas, and I feel like he was kind of there containing the insanity that is the big ideas and being able to put it all down to tape in a way that people can actually, take it in.
I think, certain are like the artist Van Morrison. You can't really discuss rationally why he's a great artist, because he's in a different plane of existence. Bob Dylan is probably the same kind of thing. And I think that's what Eno is as a producer. He's not your typical, oh, I have this skill set and I have this great mic collection. He just approaches it very differently. It's more like, I would say Rick Rubin is like the descendant of Brian Eno. It's more of a philosophy of music than a like, this is what I do as a producer.
Rick Rubin just a few weeks ago put out a new book on creativity, and I just read it. I was on vacation for a week, and that's what I was reading while I was there. So I'm fresh into the Rick Rubin zone, and he's such like a Zen spirit, you know. Instead of being super hands on, he's just kind of in the room with the artist, taking it in, and then 2 hours later he'll just pop in an idea like, hey, what if we started the song with that instead of waiting for the chorus? And the band's always like, oh my god, that's such a good idea. I find that Rick Rubin has a great ability to work with older artists that have kind of lost their way a little bit, and
Yeah.
to somehow get them in the right mindset back to when they were making their best music. He's like the comeback producer, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, we were talking about William S. Burroughs, and one of his writing techniques was he would write words or he would write a paragraph, and then he would cut it into little pieces, and he would scatter the pieces, and then he would tape them together randomly, and that would be the writing. Well, Eno does the same thing. He would do like a tarot card. He would like have weird suggestions and, make it purple or something. And it was always like trying to like mess with things to make them different, and not just like this is how we make a song. It starts here and it ends here. And there's the for Remain in Light, the single Once in a Lifetime, I read this amazing thing that Eno said part of the reason that song sounds so weird is because there was a bit of a disagreement as to what the one was. Some people thought it was like a half note apart. And so it's that kind of thing. I think you can tell that he's making things difficult. He's what does he bring to the table? I think it's taking you out of your comfort zone and going somewhere completely different.
Yeah, apparently they didn't record in a normal studio, that like a mobile recording van pulled up, and they put cables through the windows. So it's like from outside, the cables ran through the windows
That was
into the apartment.
Neil Young was big on that as well. That's how they made Tonight's the Night. Because he didn't want to be in a studio. He definitely didn't want to be in a studio. And I'm with him on this. We did some recording at Metalworks in Toronto, and great studio, great guys. But there was a whole secretarial staff there, and it didn't put you in the mood. And Neil was like, I don't want interaction with anyone. Like,
and Brian Eno, we're talking about Brian Eno, and not going in studios and all that. Brian Eno has done stuff with Neil Young as well, right? That's didn't he do a Neil Young album, Brian Eno?
No, I don't think so. No, you might be thinking.
There's always Daniel Lanois and Brian Eno, but I'm mixing up the two. Yeah, so Daniel Lanois. Okay, that was the Lanois album that he did not that many years ago. Okay. But Brian Eno and Daniel Lanois, it's those two. They did a lot of U2 stuff together.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. It's all jumbled up, and it's all all the connections are coming through in the right places.
That's reminding me of another thing that one of my favorite bands, Luna. There's a song called I can't remember what it is off their Pup Tent album, and there's a guitar solo that I always thought like, wow, that guitar solo is just amazing. It sounds incredible. Luna they were an indie rock band. They weren't that successful. They didn't have that much money, but they were being produced by a guy named McCarthy, who was an assistant to Eno for the U2 albums. And so he'd taken Eno's thing as like, oh, well, if we want to get a good guitar solo, we're going to spend 4 days on it, because there is, budget constraints don't exist. So it's that kind of like level of attention, and like, we're going to keep working on this until we get it right. That so many of the bands that I love, Radiohead are like that. We're going to just keep going until we get the sound we want.
Yeah, Radiohead is one that comes up, when I ask people their favorite albums. So we had OK Computer was one in this series, but another band that has 3, 4, or 5 all-time great albums in their discography. So I listened to this album, Fear of Music, twice front to back with a good pair of studio headphones, And one thing that jumps out to me was the bass playing. It seems like I would consider it like one of the lead instruments on this album. Do you agree
Yeah,
with that?
yeah. And there weren't very many, there's Carol Kay, but there weren't very many female bass players around in the late 70s. Uh, some people, some women think that women are designed to play the bass because the low notes reverberate in their ovaries somehow. I don't know if that's true, but
Makes you want to practice more,
well,
possibly.
Kim Deal from the Pixies and Kim Gordon from Sonic Youth, but definitely Tina Weymouth, and she had a weird bass. That was some sort of weird Gibson Studio or something. Again, it was like four people all bringing something. Jerry Harrison and with his and David Byrne with their funk rhythms, and Chris France his funk drumming. And
when you look at this album, are there certain songs that stand out to you as being the strongest or your favorite? I have notes on several different songs here.
yeah,
One thing before you dive in. Yeah, no problem. The 2 hour interviews, you got to top up the water because the voice will give out at some point. What's funny is you mentioned, this is one of the rare albums where maybe cocaine actually helped in making a better album. And I have notes. The final song on the album is called Drugs, and my note is what are the chances that someone was on drugs while writing and recording this song? So quite
well,
high apparently.
I would think so. For me, one of the things that I look for in a great album is, do you have three songs, boom, 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 where these songs are untouchable? So for me, it's 2, 3, and 4: Mind, Paper, and Cities. And
Okay.
they're frantic. They're, at the end of Mind, it's this weird coda of guitar that comes out of nowhere and just takes over the song. Paper just has this amazing guitar arpeggio thing to the start that it's so much of the album is frantic. Cities starts with one of my favorite things, the fade up. So there's very few songs that fade up, but when they do, it's like it's just, yeah, the album, it's skittery, it's paranoid, it's like too much coffee and cocaine. It's the cover is just black with raised the diamond,
like tiles, yeah,
or like a manhole cover, or like a Mesa Boogie rectifier, the little back and forth things. Very, very urban, very cold and uncompromising.
What I found strange is the album cover doesn't look like anything special. Like, yeah, it's appropriate for the music, but in 1980 it was up for best recording package at the Grammys. Like, it got nominated based on that album.
Well, because you were missing it. It's letterpress. It's these diamonds are punched out.
Oh, it's actually raised on it.
Actually raised.
So it's as a whole that it was nominated.
Yeah.
See what we miss here with Spotify
Exactly.
and digital? We're not getting the goods, man.
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, those three songs, Memories Can't Wait to close side one. That's maybe my favorite Talking Heads album song of all time. It's, again, at the end, it just goes into overdrive. And again, David Byrne just has this sense of like panic in his voice. It's very, it's not relaxing, but it's again, yeah, it's awe. I'm in awe.
So by the time we got to the song Mind, it's where David Byrne's vocals like really stood out to me. And the notes I took are, man, he's such a unique vocalist. The delivery, the phrasing, the mix of speaking and singing, the notes he hits. I mean, when he sings, it's him. There's nobody that sounds like that.
Yeah. Yeah, he just it's not like here's the melody, I'm going to sing it. It's yelping and screaming yeah, it's just and I think that's possibly part of Eno's thing. It's like there are no rules. We're not trying to sound like anything. We're trying to sound like something that's never been done before, and he consistently succeeded with that.
I listened to the album again today. I went for a 30-minute walk before the interview just to get some fresh air, get the juices flowing. And for Life During Wartime, which was that was the first single, I put down wicked disco dance groove to it. I found I had a little extra pep in my step when that one came
100%.
on.
Yeah.
Yeah. What other notes do I have for some of these? I found in the song Air, there was this weird, like, extraterrestrial synth sound that came in the verses, this weird synthy sound that would pop in. And I'm like, I don't know what instrument makes that. And I thought that Heaven had one of the best choruses I've heard from a Talking Heads song.
Yeah.
And it was the harmonies. It's like it drops into this low note and comes in at the start of each line. And that harmony, like, that's the awe, you know?
No, Heaven is always the choice for, like, it's like the thinking man's solo acoustic guitar player, coffee house guy.
If you want to impress somebody with that song. I guess the last point about any of the songs, Animals, near the end of the album. I thought that was such a strange song with the lyrics.
Yeah. Yeah, and just the second side, that everything's one or two: air, heaven, animals, electric guitar, drugs. It's like these are the things you need.
That's a snapshot right there. Yeah, the title "Fear of Music." Apparently, there was so much pressure on them for writing their music, right, that they just called it "Fear of Music." It's like they don't, you don't want to go to work on Monday, kind of thing.
And again, it's a perfect title for the the ones, the other two Eno songs bracketing this one. They don't have the same kind of, like, paranoid, like I'm afraid kind of thing going on.
So I have two reviews of the album, and then a few lists that name it as one of the best albums of all time. So Rolling Stone says Fear of Music is often deliberately and brilliantly disorienting. The album is foreboding, inescapably urban, and obsessed with texture. And that has to do with the artwork as well. It's all one thing. And then New York Magazine says what makes the record so successful, it genuinely felt anti-elitist. Talking Heads was clever enough to make the intellectual infectious and even danceable. So the thinking man's band.
Yep.
And then we have three lists here. So NME placed Fear of Music at number 68 on its all-time 100 albums. Channel 4 ranked it at number 76 during its 100 Greatest Albums countdown, and it was included in the book 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die. So that's what I have for Fear of Music. I have some comments sent in here from someone on YouTube. The YouTube handle is I have no idea what I'm doing 500. That's who sent this in. So whoever you are, I have no idea what I'm doing 500. This is from them. They say Bill is my all-time favorite music. I'm so jealous you get to interview him. So yeah, no questions, just comments. So there you go, sprinkling some comments in here. And we are down to the final album. Got to reshuffle my pages here. So Guided by Voices, Alien Lanes. This comes out in 1995. This is, man, you put me to work. This is 28 songs. And even though that 28 songs sounds overwhelming, it still only clocks in at 41 minutes. So what can you tell us about this album?
Well, I knew I had to have on this list a 90s indie rock album. And my choices were this or Pavement Wowie Zowie, or maybe Soft Bulletin, or Spiritualized Ladies and Gentlemen, We Are Floating in Space. And I went with this one. And then I thought, I don't know if that was the right choice. And then just a couple days ago, I listened to it all the way through, partly because I wanted to recognize what every song was. So I have them listed here with, like, sheet notes to remember, oh, right, it's this song. And it to me, this album sounds like one of the greatest bands of all time, their greatest hits collection. It's just there's no bad song. There's only short songs, and so he's able to distill he's able to recognize what's great, and that's what a producer does. You like take away the bad stuff and accentuate the good stuff. And I mean, this one is just it. The funny story about this one is when I was hanging around in Toronto in the 90s, we all went to Rotate This on Queen Street, right between just west of Bathurst, and a guy named Chris Harper was worked there. It was owned by a guy named Pierre. I think it's still around. I think it moved around the corner a while ago. I think Pierre still runs it. Chris has long since moved on. He has a bar called Pharmacy in Parkdale. And Chris was the ultimate arbiter of good taste. And he told you what albums to buy and what albums not to buy. And I went in, I read about Guided by Voices, and like, wow, it sounds like this band is for me. And I said, Chris, should I buy Alien Lanes? And he said, Bill, do you have the White Album? I said, yes. He said, then you don't need it. I told him about that one of the last times I saw him 5 or 10 years ago. He said, God, I was such an asshole back then. So when the next album came out, I bought that and I went, oh yeah, this band is for me. And I went back and listened to this. It's flawlessly sequenced. The first album is the first song is an introduction. It's, the club is open. They actually had a sign that said the club is open. And then the last song is an ending song, and the penultimate song, Always Crush Me, is just that kind of second last, like super, super heavy, intense song. And in between it again, and then the important thing to understand is this is a Tascam 4-track recording with a cheap, realistic microphone, like not even a 57, like a stereo realistic microphone. Famously, you probably read this as well, they got $100,000 advance and it cost $10, which is probably like a little
box. They said if we took out all the money we spent on beer, the album would be about $10,
because it would be like a box of cassette tapes of Maxell XL90s. And it's sequenced so perfectly. And again, like Fear of Music, the 4-track allows it to occupy this bizarre sonic space that just shape shifts all the time. I mean, the Steely Dan record, it's very diverse, but it's kind of grounded in this. But in a single 45-second song, so many of these songs will just dramatically change. The 4-track has the ability to make it this incredible soundscape of like what's going on. What's the one I'm thinking of?
It's hard to find within 28 songs.
It's hard to find a song that just repeats this line. Sometimes I get the feeling that you don't want me around. It's very garagey, and it stops after 15 seconds. And then it goes into this middle with a little bit of acoustic guitar. And then it goes back to the beginning, but it sounds totally different. It has a harmony, but everything, the vocals sound different. The drums and guitar sound different. But the whole thing is over in about 33 seconds. And it just takes you on this. I always thought, like, okay, that beginning is okay, but it's a little, and then when it reintroduces it with a harmony, it's like, oh, now it makes sense. I think it's Pimple Zoo. Yeah, it's called Pimple Zoo.
So you're describing this lo-fi, 4-track cassette recorder, that sound. That's not just this album. That's what they're known for. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, they started out. See, Guided by Voices is just the strangest albums. You talked about 100 episodes. Robert Pollard, a couple of years ago, passed the 100 album mark. He has made, and he's, for the last at least 10 years, he's put out at least 3 albums a year. He's essentially shooting himself in the foot because no one can listen to 3 albums a year by an artist year after year after year. I'm constantly, every so often, I run across a newer song and I go, oh, I thought it was over for Robert Pollard. I thought he'd like blown his load and that was it. And I hear a song like, wow, this is as good as the classic period. So this is the highlight, maybe the highlight of the classic period of Guided by Voices. So this is a band, at this point, he's a 37-year-old elementary school teacher in Dayton, Ohio. And not even Dayton, when I started getting into them and hearing about it, was always Dayton, Ohio. And I read the biography and all his buddies are like, why do you keep saying Dayton? What, we live in fucking Northridge, like just
outside,
a shitty part of Dayton. Apparently, about 2 or 3 albums before this, his wife and his wife's parents took him out to dinner and said, hey, I know you really like this music thing, but maybe it's time to start concentrating on being a teacher and just put this music thing to rest. And just shortly after that, somehow a tape wound up in the hands of Gerard Cosloy, the founder of Matador Records. And they played CBGB, and Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth was there, and the Beastie Boys were there. And this was the height of grunge, where what you did live was, you stood there with a stern look on your face, very calm and in control. Well, these guys, they played like the Who, Robert Pollard does karate kicks and mic twirls and and they all just, and all these 2 cool indie rock guys were like, wow, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. And they're a great live band that's totally different than what they do in the recording. They're both great because the songs are great, but somehow the songs work with 4-track perfectly. One of the things is, I remember around the time, the early 90s, if you listen to almost any major label recording with an acoustic guitar on it, the acoustic guitar sounded awful. The engineers seem to have lost the ability, or they were relying too much on pickups. It would have this like overly trebly. It didn't sound like a great 60s or 70s, except Guided by Voices, because they, I think like if there's no hiss, if there's no tape hiss, your acoustic guitar is not going to sound good. And they understood that. So the acoustic sounds are so real and organic and full sounding.
I was going to mention their prolific output. If a band releases, I don't know, 8 full-length albums in their career, I mean, that's pretty good. These guys, they have 35, like the band itself, Guided by Voices, 35 full-length albums. That's insane. I mean, how is that even possible? I mean, that pales in comparison to the 100 albums you said that one of the members has released, but
but he's the band. I mean, he's the only constant member in the band. They've done, this was the classic period. They've done tours recently with the classic period, but I saw them in 15 years ago. They had a different lineup than what they have today. It's always young guys that want to play, and they had, like I was talking about earlier about runs of amazing albums. This period from 1993 to 1998, I think he put out 3 solo albums. They're all amazing, and all the albums are amazing. They're just I consider this album flawless. There's a song called Ex Supermodel. It has snoring on it. very high in the mix. I don't know if you recognize that. There's an electric guitar and Pollard singing and snoring, because he's a drinker, Robert Pollard. He lived in the suburbs with his wife and his kids, and in the backyard he had a clubhouse called the Monument Club, and his buddies would come over and drink. So they recorded some guy snoring one night, and it's really nasty snoring, and it's, again, really high in the mix. And I'm convinced that if you took the snoring out, the song would be too good. It would it would destroy your brain. I think Robert Pollard's peers in melodicism are Paul McCartney, and I think he's one of the greatest melody writers of all time. The Mitch from Dawn Vale that we were talking about in our interview, he's a giant Guided by Voices fan like me. And one day I said to him, like, is Robert Pollard just the best rock singer of all time? And Mitch said, no, he's not. And I thought, oh, I guess you're right. I mean, he's drunk all the time, so he doesn't always sing so well. It's a cross between John Lennon, Peter Gabriel, and Roger Daltrey. But he's such a gifted melodicist that it comes across like he's the greatest singer of all time, because he can't write a bad melody.
Do you think he's underappreciated as an artist?
Well, that's I don't know what that term means. I mean, it was the 90s. He was an indie rock, like I said, if it were the 70s, he would be Steely Dan.
Okay.
He would sell lots of records, but that wasn't going to happen in the 90s. Things had, indie rock was invented because things went so wrong in the 80s, because major labels signed shitty bands, and if you wanted to be a great band, you, like the Replacements or the Pixies or Sonic Youth, you were in the indie territory. Whereas in the 70s, you'd be Talking Heads and Steely Dan.
So out of the 5 albums that you chose, this is the one that I really have to get back to, because again, with the 28 songs, you listen through it and it's a lot to take in. So it's one that you need a few listens to sink your teeth into it, and to differentiate between the 28 songs and remember what happened in what song, instead of it kind of blurring together. So I like what I heard, and I'm excited to go back and actually, further explore this album, especially with all the insight that you provided for it today. So I have a few reviews and then a couple questions to wrap up. So Rolling Stone described the album's music as hooky rock that infuses songwriting smarts and a love of melody, like you mentioned, with a sometimes spiky, sometimes whimsical sense of experimentation. Then The Guardian gave the album a positive review, stating that Pollard's songs are gems that stay just this side of self-conscious eccentricity, and the song's lengths were just enough time for him to wheeze a few oblique lines and guitarist Tobin Sprout to trace out a raucous melody. Couple more things. Pitchfork has the album in their top 100 albums of the 90s at number 27, and Magnet named it the best album of 1995. So that's everything I have for that album. Any last thing you want to add before we
just the kind of Pollard was his own Brian Eno. He made these records, a song called Chicken Blows, which is a very Beatlesque kind of ballad, I guess. There's a weird vibrato in his voice. It turns out someone is pounding his back like this. So it goes, chicken blows. That's the vibrato. Someone's pounding, karate chopping on his back like this. And then
I thought they added like a phaser or something going on.
And then a backing vocal comes in, and then it comes in really loud, and then they just, oh, that's too loud. Let's turn it, and then it's almost gone. There's a haphazardness to the mixing that just makes it all work somehow. It shouldn't. you shouldn't, you could listen to this and go, this is a bad demo, but somehow it's not. It's, again, like it's bringing you into this soundscape that no one's been able to replicate, and even with a full band, it always sounds, things are indistinct, but they sound great. You can hear the drummer losing tempo and it doesn't matter, just like a 60s or 70s recording.
I feel like all those little quirks are a part of what make the album endearing, like that make it unique.
Yeah. And but it's, like I said, it's one fantastic song after another.
So I have one final comment sent here. So this is from Proleptic Thoughts on YouTube. He says, I've been a fan of Treble Charger since the 1990s and have seen them numerous times live. I've met Bill several times as well. Great group of guys. So that's the final comment that we have sent in here. And maybe two more questions and then we'll wrap up. Is there an album that you love that would surprise our listeners? So you think maybe people look at you and with your choices, they're thinking, okay, he likes rock or he likes indie rock or he likes whatever. Is there any album that seems to be outside of your wheelhouse, maybe a guilty pleasure that you love that you can share? There's a Justin Bieber album in there. I know. Come on. Give us the goods.
Not. No, there's no. I like old pop music. That kind of predates the album era. I love the Carpenters. I love ABBA. Lately, I'm really into, and this is kind of like, it's having a moment in terms of TV and movie placement of over the top crooners from the 60s. The songs like A Man Without Love by Engelbert Humperdinck, or I Gotta Be Me by Steve Lawrence, that kind of like over the top scenery chewing kind of pop. I love that kind of, or the really dramatic stuff. Dusty Springfield, things like that. Early Bee Gees, way before Saturday Night Fever. I love sappy 60s stuff like that.
That's a good answer. So we have a tradition on the podcast where we ask the last guest to leave a question for the next guest without knowing who it is. So in your case, the last guest, just 2 days ago, I had an interview with Tony Rabelow of Bedouin Soundclash and Joy Drop. And his question for you is, which non-musical places do you find inspiration from?
Yeah, that one's pretty easy for me. It would be like the Sault Ste. Marie is a steel town. It's like any small town in North America. It's having lots of trouble with lots of things. It's got a really bad fentanyl problem, and it's the middle class is kind of dying. And but if you drive anywhere for 20 minutes, you're in some of the most beautiful country in the world. So for me, the inspiration is the rocks and the white pines of the Canadian Shield, and being on the water, and that's all. If I need to write lyrics, I'll go for a walk with a notepad and sit on a rock and look at trees and see what comes.
Nature does it for you. Now, can you pay it forward? Can you ask a question for the next guest? I don't even know who the next guest is. I just got back from vacation, so I gotta book the next guest. Any question you can put out there?
Yeah, my question would be, what do you do to try and take yourself out of your comfort zone?
Comfort zone. That's a good question. Perfect. All right. So where can our listeners find you online if they want to stay up to date, if they want to see what you're up to, if they're looking for that new music that'll come out in the near future, maybe they want to send you a quick message saying they love the interview or they love your music. Where can they find you online?
Well, it's easy to find me on Facebook. I'm not very good at But I'm probably going to be putting together some sort of Instagram or Facebook page for Pointless as we get closer to the release of music, like I say, in June.
Perfect. Last question. Is there anything you'd like to say to your fans that have been with you since the very start of your music career, through the different bands, through the different projects, still waiting? You know, they're still here waiting on new music because they love what you do. We heard all those comments from people saying you're their favorite artist of all time. You've put out some of their favorite music of all time. Any words to those fans that have supported you?
Thanks for sticking with me. I plan to keep making music, and I mean, like I said, I don't write with fans in mind, but that doesn't mean they're not important, because I'm a fan myself, and I know how special that bond is. So thanks for your support, and hope to see you in Toronto and Hamilton in June.
Perfect. Well, Bill, thank you for the last 2 hours. I really appreciate it. Thank you for sharing your 5 picks with me. I've added them to my playlist so I can keep listening to them and add them to my list of great albums that I check out every now and then. I really appreciate it. And to our listeners, you know, the Bill fans, the Treble Charger fans, thanks for sticking with us for the last 2 hours, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks, Joel.
You're very welcome. If you've enjoyed today's episode of the podcast, please take a moment to subscribe, like, comment, and share. What I want to know is, who would you like me to sit down with next for a 2-hour deep dive interview? You can let me know by reaching out to me on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at Joel Martin Mastery. Joel is Joel. And you can find me on Twitter and Snapchat at Joel Mastery. So I am done. I am complete. I approve this message, and I'll see you on the next episode.